He said I'd die alone with my cats, and now as I watch him through my penthouse window, struggling to parallel park his rusted Honda while my husband's Bentley gleams in our driveway, I can't help but smile at how spectacularly wrong he was about everything. The memory still cuts like broken glass, even 3 years later. Marcus. My college boyfriend, the one I thought I'd marry, the one who knew exactly where to press to make it hurt the most. I can still feel the cold February air biting at my face as I stood outside his apartment building, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I'd driven 2 hours through a snowstorm to surprise him for Valentine's Day, clutching a homemade card and his favorite cookies like some pathetic romantic comedy heroine. But the surprise was mine. The sound that escaped from behind his door wasn't laughter, it was something much worse, something primal and rhythmic that made my stomach drop into my shoes. My key, the one he'd given me with such ceremony 6 months earlier, turned in the lock with a soft click that might as well have been a gunshot. She was beautiful, of course. Long auburn hair spilled across my pillow, the pillow I'd embroidered with little hearts thinking it was cute. Her legs were wrapped around his waist, and they were so lost in each other that neither noticed me standing frozen in the doorway like a statue carved from pure humiliation. Time stretched like taffy. My brain tried to process what I was seeing, cycling through denial, bargaining, desperate rationalization. Maybe I was in the wrong apartment. Maybe this was some sick joke. Maybe I was having a stroke and hallucinating my worst fears. Then Marcus saw me. His face went white, then red, then white again. The girl, I never did learn her name, scrambled for the sheets with a squeak of surprise. But Marcus? Marcus just stared at me with something that looked almost like relief. Like he'd been waiting for this moment, hoping for it even. The cookies fell from my numb fingers, scattering across the hardwood floor like broken promises. I should have screamed, should have thrown things, made a scene, demanded answers. Instead, I just stood there bleeding internally while my carefully constructed future collapsed around me like a house of cards in a hurricane. The girl muttered something about leaving, gathering her clothes with the efficiency of someone who'd clearly done this before. She brushed past me without making eye contact, and I caught a whiff of the expensive perfume I'd been saving up to buy for myself. Only when the door clicked shut behind her did Marcus finally speak. He didn't apologize, didn't explain. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bed, our bed, the one where we'd planned our future just the night before, and delivered the killing blow with surgical precision. You know what, Sarah? Maybe this is for the best. We both know you're not exactly the type guys fight over. You'll probably end up one of those crazy cat ladies, collecting strays because it's easier than dealing with actual relationships. At least cats can't cheat on you, right? The words hit like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. He knew about my insecurities, my fear of abandonment, my desperate need to be wanted. He'd held me through panic attacks about growing old alone, had whispered reassurances about our future together, and now he was weaponizing every vulnerability I'd ever shared with him. You're too needy, Sarah. Too intense. Normal guys want fun, not some clingy girl who plans their whole wedding after 6 months. You'll probably die alone with your cats, making up stories about how we could have worked out if I'd just tried harder. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to point out that he'd been just as invested in our relationship as I was, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt like I'd swallowed razors, and my vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall in front of him. So I left, walked out of his apartment, down those stairs I'd climbed so hopefully just minutes before, and into my car where I finally let the sobs tear through me like a physical force. My chest felt like it was caving in, ribs crushing my lungs until each breath was a conscious effort. The drive home was a blur of snow and salt and windshield wipers that couldn't keep up with either the storm outside or the one raging inside my skull. I kept replaying his words, examining them from every angle like evidence at a crime scene. Maybe this is for the best. Too needy, too intense. Die alone with your cats. The cat's comment stung the most because it wasn't even accurate. I didn't have cats. Had never wanted cats. The one time I'd mentioned maybe getting a pet, Marcus had immediately shot down the idea, claiming he was allergic. Just another lie and what I was beginning to realize had been a relationship built on them. Back in my tiny studio apartment, I collapsed onto my secondhand couch and stared at the vision board I'd made just weeks before. Pictures of wedding dresses and honeymoon destinations stared back at me, suddenly looking ridiculous and desperate. I'd been so sure, so confident in our love story. The good girl who reforms the bad boy. The patient girlfriend who gets rewarded with forever. What a joke. Sleep came in fragments that night, interrupted by phantom phone buzzes and the irrational hope that Marcus would call to apologize, to explain, to beg me to come back. But my phone remained stubbornly silent, and by morning I understood that this was really it. 3 years of my life gone. The future I'd built in my head, demolished. But it was his parting shot that kept echoing in my mind as days turned to weeks. You'll probably die alone with your cats. He'd meant it to destroy me, and for a while it did. I went through the motions of living, work, grocery shopping, pretending to be fine when my coworkers asked about my weekend plans. But inside, I was conducting a thorough inventory of every flaw he'd ever pointed out, every moment of neediness he'd criticized, every way I'd apparently failed as a girlfriend. The worst part was wondering if he was right. Maybe I was too intense. Maybe I did want too much too fast. Maybe normal, successful men would always see through me to the desperate, damaged girl underneath and run the other way. Maybe I really would end up alone, collecting cats as consolation prizes for a life unlived. The depression hit like a fog rolling in from the ocean, gradual at first, then all-consuming. I stopped washing my hair regularly, lived on takeout and whatever I could microwave, avoided mirrors because the hollow-eyed stranger looking back wasn't someone I recognized. My sister Emma called constantly, worried about my radio silence. My mom kept leaving voicemails about some nice boy from church she wanted to introduce me to, but I let them all go to voicemail, convinced that anyone who got close enough would eventually see what Marcus had seen, that I was fundamentally unlovable, destined for solitude and regret. 3 months later, sitting in my therapist's office with tissues clutched in my fists, I finally said the words out loud. He said I'd die alone with my cats, and I think he might be right. Doctor. Martinez had been listening to my spiral with the patience of someone who'd heard this song before. She was a tiny woman with kind eyes and an uncanny ability to cut through bullshit with surgical precision. Sarah, she said, leaning forward in her chair, what if I told you that the cruelest lies often contain just enough truth to make us believe them entirely? I stared at her, not understanding. You're not too intense because you wanted a future with someone you loved. You're not needy because you expected fidelity from your partner. And you're certainly not destined to die alone because one insecure man needed to tear you down to feel better about his own moral failures. But what if nothing? What if is just another way of saying, what if I accept his version of my story instead of writing my own? That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not healing, that would take months more, but something harder and sharper. A recognition that I'd been allowing Marcus to narrate my life even after he'd exited it. What if I wrote a different story? The question haunted me as I walked out of that session and into the crisp autumn air. What if his prophecy didn't have to become my reality? What if instead of dying alone with cats, I lived boldly without him? The idea felt dangerous and thrilling and completely foreign. For so long, I'd defined myself in relation to other people, the good daughter, the devoted girlfriend, the helpful coworker. But what if I defined myself by my own standards instead? I started small, painted my apartment walls a bold turquoise that Marcus would have hated, bought expensive face cream and red lipstick and wore both to the grocery store just because I could, signed up for a pottery class I'd been wanting to take for years but never had because Marcus thought art was pretentious. Each small act of defiance felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd lost somewhere along the way. But it was the night I ran into James at the coffee shop that everything really began to change. I was there late, grading papers and nursing my third latte of the evening, when he approached my table with the confidence of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. Tall, dark hair with just enough gray at the temples to suggest wisdom, dressed in the kind of expensive casual clothes that whispered rather than shouted about money. "Excuse me," he said, and his voice was warm honey over gravel, "but are you Sarah Mitchell? The high school English teacher?" I looked up from my stack of essays about symbolism in The Great Gatsby, suddenly hyper-aware of my messy bun and the pen mark on my cheek. "Yes? I'm James Wellington. My daughter Emma is in your AP Literature class. She comes home every day raving about your discussions on unreliable narrators and feminist literary theory. I've been wanting to thank you for inspiring her to pursue English in college. Emma Wellington." Sweet, brilliant Emma with her insightful questions and wicked sense of humor. I'd noticed her last name on the enrollment roster, but hadn't made the connection to Wellington Industries, the tech company that had revolutionized data security and made its founder one of the youngest billionaires in the country. She's an exceptional student, I managed, trying not to gawk at him like a star-struck teenager. Very insightful. She gets that from her mother, he said with a smile that transformed his entire face. Would you mind if I bought you a coffee? I'd love to hear more about what you're doing to make literature come alive for these kids. 3 hours later, we were still talking. About books and teaching, about his daughter and his work, about travel and art, and the way certain songs could transport you back to moments you'd forgotten you'd lived. He was intelligent without being condescending, successful without being arrogant, and he listened, really listened, when I spoke. When he asked for my number, I almost said no. The voice in my head, the one that sounded suspiciously like Marcus, whispered that this was too good to be true, that men like James Wellington didn't date high school teachers from small towns, that I was setting myself up for another spectacular failure. But something Dr. Martinez had said echoed louder. What if I accept his version of my story instead of writing my own? So I said yes. Our first official date was at a tiny Italian restaurant I'd mentioned loving, nothing fancy or flashy. James arrived on time with flowers, not roses, but wildflowers in shades of purple and yellow that reminded me of spring mornings. He held doors and asked questions and seemed genuinely interested in my answers. Over candlelight and perfectly seasoned pasta, he told me about losing his wife to cancer 5 years earlier, about raising Emma alone, about building his company as much to provide for her future as to challenge himself professionally. His grief was evident but not overwhelming, processed and integrated rather than raw and bleeding. And when I found myself sharing the story of Marcus, edited and sanitized but still painful, James's response floored me. He sounds like he was threatened by your capacity for love, he said simply. Some people mistake intensity for weakness, but I think it's actually a superpower. The ability to care deeply, to invest fully in another person, that's rare and precious. I felt something crack open in my chest, some ice I hadn't even realized had formed around my heart. We dated for 6 months before he proposed, and not once during that time did I feel needy or too intense or like I was asking for more than he wanted to give. James pursued me with the same focused determination he brought to everything else in his life, making it clear from the beginning that he was looking for forever, not just for now. The engagement ring was stunning but not ostentatious, a vintage Art Deco piece that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a jewelry store display case. He proposed at the botanical gardens where we'd had our third date, down on one knee next to the rose bushes with tears in his eyes and a speech about how I'd brought color back into his world. I said yes before he finished asking the question. The wedding was everything I'd dreamed of but bigger and more beautiful than I'd ever dared imagine. My parents cried through the entire ceremony. Emma, now my stepdaughter and co-conspirator, was my maid of honor and gave a speech that had everyone reaching for tissues. James's vows were poetry, promises of partnership and adventure and a love that would grow stronger with time. But the moment that mattered most came later, during our honeymoon in Italy, when James surprised me with adoption papers for 3 rescue dogs, Gatsby, Daisy, and Nick, named after my favorite literary characters. I thought cats were supposed to be the spinster's companion of choice, he said with a grin that was pure mischief. But I figured dogs were more our style. Looking at those papers, at this beautiful man who'd listened to my fears and turned them into inside jokes, I realized something profound. Marcus hadn't been predicting my future when he'd made that cruel pronouncement. He'd been revealing his own limitations, his inability to see past his own insecurities to the woman I actually was. I didn't die alone with cats. I married a millionaire and got 3 dogs instead. But more than that, I learned to write my own story. The revenge wasn't planned, not initially. It was just the natural result of living well, of refusing to accept someone else's cramped vision of my possibilities. But as the months passed and my new life settled into its rhythm of contentment, I found myself thinking more and more about Marcus and that final cutting prediction. Part of me wanted to let it go, to be the bigger person, to focus on my happiness without looking backward. But another part, the part that still woke up sometimes in the middle of the night with his words echoing in my head, wanted him to know exactly how wrong he'd been. The opportunity presented itself on a random Tuesday evening when James and I were walking the dogs through downtown. Gatsby had tangled his leash around a lamppost, and while I was untangling him, I heard a familiar voice behind me. Sarah? Sarah Mitchell? I turned and there he was. Marcus, looking older and softer around the edges, wearing the same leather jacket he'd thought made him look dangerous in college, but now just made him look like he was trying too hard to recapture his youth. "Oh, wow," he continued, taking in my appearance with obvious surprise. "You look great, really great." I was wearing a cashmere sweater James had bought me in Milan, my hair professionally styled, my skin glowing with the kind of happiness that can't be faked. The dogs sat obediently at my feet, well-trained and beautiful, their designer collars catching the streetlight. "Thank you," I said simply, not offering any explanation or context. Are these your dogs?" "3 of them, yes." I gestured to where James was waiting patiently by the fountain, probably giving us privacy while staying close enough to intervene if needed. "That's my husband." Marcus followed my gaze, and I watched his face cycle through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been regret. James looked every inch the successful businessman, even in casual clothes, his bearing confident and assured. "You got married?" Marcus asked, and there was something fragile in his voice that took me back to the boy I'd fallen in love with before he'd become the man who'd destroyed me 2 years ago. "We're very happy." The words hung in the air between us, loaded with everything I wasn't saying. "We're happy. I'm happy. Your prediction was wrong. Your assessment of my worth was wrong. Everything you said about my future was wrong." That's wonderful, Sarah. Really. I'm glad things worked out for you." He was trying to be gracious, but I could see the questions in his eyes. How? When? Why him and not me? The same questions I might have asked if our positions were reversed. James approached then, extending his hand with the kind of easy confidence that came from never doubting his own worth. "I don't think we've met." "James Wellington." Marcus shook his hand, and I watched him register the name, the recognition dawning slowly. Wellington Industries, the billionaire, the man who'd built an empire and then married a high school teacher because he saw something in her worth treasuring. "Marcus Thompson," he said weakly. "Nice to meet you, Marcus. Sarah's told me about you." It was a perfectly neutral statement, but something in James's tone suggested he knew exactly who Marcus was and what he'd done. My husband wasn't prone to dramatic gestures or public confrontations, but he had a way of making his opinions known through subtle shifts in temperature. Marcus's eyes darted between us, clearly trying to process this new reality. The girl he'd deemed unlovable had not only found love but had found it with someone so far out of his league it wasn't even the same sport. "Well," he said finally, clearing his throat, "I should let you get back to your evening." "It was good seeing you, Sarah." "You too," I replied, and meant it. Not because I'd missed him or wanted him back, but because this moment felt like closure in a way I hadn't expected. As he walked away, shoulders slightly hunched in defeat, I felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. Not for his loneliness or his obvious regret, but for the narrowness of his vision, his inability to see past his own limitations to the possibilities that existed in the world. "Everything okay?" James asked quietly, his hand finding mine. "Perfect," I said, and realized I meant that too. We walked home in comfortable silence, the dogs trotting ahead of us, and I thought about the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. From heartbreak to healing, from self-doubt to self-acceptance, from Marcus's cruel prophecy to this beautiful reality. That night, as I lay in bed next to my husband with Gatsby sprawled across the foot of the mattress and Daisy and Nick curled up in their expensive beds nearby, I thought about the girl I'd been 3 years ago, the one who'd believed she was too much, too needy, destined for solitude. She'd been wrong about almost everything, but she'd been right about one thing: love was worth fighting for. She just hadn't realized she needed to fight for self-love first, to become someone worthy of the kind of partnership she craved. Marcus had meant to curse me with his parting words, to plant a seed of fear that would grow into a self-fulfilling prophecy. Instead, he'd accidentally given me a roadmap for everything I didn't want to become. In trying to diminish me, he'd shown me exactly how much bigger I could be. I never saw him again after that night, but I heard through mutual friends that he'd moved back to his hometown, was working at his father's insurance agency, still single and still bitter about how his life had turned out. The girl from that Valentine's Day night had apparently been one in a long series of meaningless encounters, none of which had led to anything lasting. Some stories end with dramatic confrontations or elaborate revenge schemes. Mine ended with something more subtle but infinitely more satisfying, the quiet triumph of proving someone wrong simply by living well. I did not die alone with cats. I married a millionaire and got 3 dogs instead. But more importantly, I learned that the most powerful revenge isn't about hurting the people who hurt you. It's about becoming so genuinely happy that their opinion of you becomes irrelevant. The woman who stood in that doorway watching her boyfriend cheat had believed she was fundamentally flawed, destined for disappointment. The woman I became understood that she'd simply been with the wrong person, trying to force a connection that was never meant to last. Love, it turns out, isn't about finding someone willing to tolerate your flaws. It's about finding someone who sees your intensity as passion, your need for connection as strength, your capacity for caring as the gift it truly is. 3 years later, watching the sunrise from my penthouse window while my husband made coffee and our dogs played in the yard below, I finally understood what Dr. Martinez had been trying to tell me. The cruelest lies often contain just enough truth to make us believe them entirely. Marcus had been right about one thing. I had wanted more than he was capable of giving, but he'd been wrong about everything else. I wasn't too much for the right person. I wasn't destined for loneliness. And I certainly wasn't going to die alone with cats. Instead, I was going to live boldly with dogs and a man who thought my intensity was beautiful, who pursued me as ardently as I'd once chased impossible dreams, and who saw my capacity for love as exactly what it was, not a weakness to be ashamed of, but a strength to be celebrated. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to become the person someone else insists you are. Sometimes it's building a life so full and beautiful that their small-minded predictions become laughably irrelevant. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it's finding out that the future you thought was impossible was actually just around the corner, waiting for you to stop believing other people's stories about who you were supposed to be and start writing your own instead. He said I'd die alone with my cats. Instead, I learned to live authentically with my dogs, my husband, and my own beautifully imperfect, wonderfully intense, absolutely lovable self. The girl who cried in that parking lot 3 years ago would be amazed by the woman I became. Not because I married money or achieved some fairy tale ending, but because I learned the most important lesson of all. The only person's opinion of your worth that truly matters is your own. And I think I'm pretty amazing, cats or no cats.